issues, and particularly with respect to environmental harm. And this is the session where we actually get to discuss this in some depth, and we're really privileged to have two speakers here today to guide us along. We're going to run both speakers back to back without questions, and then at the end of the second speaker, we'll open it up for questions. This is a situation where it makes more sense than having questions after each paper. The order of the speakers will be the reverse of what we have in the program for reasons that I guess will probably be apparent. It just makes more sense to do it in that order. The two speakers will be, first of all, Hadley Friedland. Hadley Friedland is currently a doctoral student and also Vanier Scholar in the Faculty of Law at the University of Alberta, and her doctoral dissertation explores the contemporary articulation and application of Cree legal principles in Canada. Our second speaker will be Terry Lynn Williams-Davidson, who practices law with the White Raven Law Corporation in Surrey, British Columbia. Terry Lynn is a citizen of the Haida Nation and also its general counsel, and she has represented the Haida Nation at all levels of courts in Canada, including the Supreme Court. So without further ado, we'll begin with Hadley.
Okay, thank you. And I'm happy to be here and be part of this today. My work is not focused always on environmental issues. As pointed out, I am looking at Cree legal traditions, and the broader topic is looking at Indigenous legal traditions across Canada. My focus is Cree, but there's many nations. So I was asked to talk about the engagement of Indigenous legal traditions in the context of environmental issues. And the theme of my talk here today and the theme of my paper is the old saying, it's better to know some of the questions than all of the answers. And first, this is because I don't have any answers to provide you, so we'll get that out of the way. But also, I hope to leave us with some questions that might be useful going forward. So let me begin by saying I do believe that practical engagement with Indigenous legal traditions in the by courts and practitioners is both important and possible to do with environmental issues. A few of the reasons that it's important: it may enable us to move past some of the sticking points. And I've heard some of that today, just some of the sticking points and conflicts over resource development and the cumulative impacts of environmental damage. It may increase understanding of Aboriginal perspectives on the impact of environmental damage. It may expand our understanding of what adequate consultation and reasonable accommodation entails. And on a broad level, it may contribute to a robust process of reconciliation here in Canada between peoples. This practical engagement is also possible, and that's the focus of my talk here today. Because even when people agree that some engagement with Indigenous legal traditions would be relevant and important when dealing with environmental issues, we are still left with the very real question of how. Indigenous legal traditions can be deeply meaningful and have great impact on the lives of people within Indigenous communities. But outside these communities, they may seem invisible and incomprehensible. So Professor Val Napoleon tells the story of a well-known litigator for Aboriginal groups, saying to her, "We all know there's something there, but we don't know how to access it." So when we discuss more public and integrated use of Indigenous legal traditions in Canada, there's very real legal and practical and political institutional issues to address. But there are also real intellectual hurdles to overcome. And how we're able to address those legal and practical and institutional questions will depend on whether we actually address the intellectual ones or whether we skip this step, and this is what I see an awful lot of, and we just assume we know certain answers about the substantive content of Indigenous legal traditions. So the first step in finding ways to practically engage with Indigenous legal traditions is about us. How can we start asking better questions? So in order to start asking better questions, I suggest we need three main things, and this is what I want to go through here, and then I want to just use it with an example that often comes up. So first, we need a logical starting point. Second, we need to make some reasonable working assumptions that flows from this logical starting point. And third, we need some way to get beyond generalities and generalizations so we can start asking targeted and useful questions that apply to specific issues. And there'll be a little irony in my talk because obviously in this time I'm talking at a very general level about how to get past generalities. So it's an inherent contradiction that you'll have to forgive me for. So let me start at the first criteria, which is a logical starting point. And I have to apologize for starting this way, and it feels a bit embarrassing to even point this out. But I want to start at this very basic level because I don't think it requires any prior knowledge whatsoever. So prior to European contact and control, Indigenous peoples lived here in this place in groups for thousands of years. And we know that when groups of people live together, they develop ways to manage themselves and all their affairs. This coordination, as Professor Jeremy Weber has put it, is the most common of common denominators of law. Therefore, as a matter of logic alone, our starting point into any inquiry has to be that at some point, and for a very long time, Indigenous peoples across Canada coordinated resource harvesting, management, and land use successfully enough to continue as societies. And we have no reason to think that these laws did not work perfectly well for thousands of years. Again, the myth of Indigenous peoples as not having these type of laws has been used as a trope. It's a trope, it's a myth by European theorists to make claims about property rights, to come up with theories, but there's no factual or logical basis for that. And it's important to make that distinction. So getting rid of illogical starting points doesn't mean we accept a utopian vision, that everything was perfect, generally, or about environmental issues. It means that we approach Indigenous legal traditions not as paragons of perfection, but as reasonable legal orders full of reasoning people. And practically, this leads us to the next criteria, which is some reasonable working assumptions that can help us frame our further inquiries more logically and productively. So, step 2, some reasonable working assumptions. Because Indigenous legal traditions existed for thousands of years and there was no state, no courts, no parliaments, we can make some logical working assumptions that can help us frame relevant questions about aspects of Indigenous laws that will matter, including questions about sources, practitioners and teachers, and methods for recording and promulgating these laws. So first, there has to be sources of Indigenous laws that aren't courts or parliaments. So it makes sense to ask, what are some of the sources of Indigenous laws? And when people are asking these questions, they're starting to come up with answers and they're starting to write them down. It's starting to become accessible. So John Burroughs, in his book, lists 5 sources, in his recent book, Canada's Indigenous Constitution, lists 5 sources: sacred, natural, deliberative, positivistic, and customary laws. And I'm just going with brief examples so there's some idea. another working assumption, there has to be practitioners and teachers of Indigenous laws who aren't lawyers or law professors. So it makes sense, again, to ask, who are some of the practitioners? Who are some of the teachers? And again, some reasonable answers are starting to emerge in publications. Burroughs suggests Indigenous laws are more broadly dispersed in a decentralized way, and some examples are elders, families, clans, and other bodies within Indigenous societies who you would turn to. And finally, there has to be some methods to record and promulgate Indigenous laws that aren't court cases, statutes, and rules, because these preceded court cases, statutes, and rules. So a useful question is, what are some of the ways Indigenous laws can be recorded and promulgated? And again, some reasonable answers are starting to emerge in publications. Burroughs gives examples such as stories, songs, practices, and even written on natural landscapes. Professor Val Napoleon discusses legal obligations being recorded in narratives, practices, rituals, and conventions. The last two set of these questions deal with resources for exploring issues from an Indigenous legal perspective. The first, the sources of law, deals with the community's legal foundations. So one thing about even asking these sort of questions may cause us to recognize and reflect on a whole other level of environmental impacts. If, as Burroughs and others argue, the natural world is one vital source of Indigenous laws, environmental damage may be viewed as damaging some very foundational parts of laws. If observations of the natural world or inscriptions on the land are pedagogical resources for recording, remembering, and passing on Indigenous laws, then changes to the environment may erase some resources for this. So considering these issues, just even thinking about these issues from this angle, may give a different perspective about why some Aboriginal communities might be adopting positions they are in relation to some specific development, depending. So the third criteria, again, my inherent contradiction here, is getting beyond generalities and generalizations. And this is what I want to spend the most time on, and I'll go through an example about how, again, just framing questions, no answers again, but how this might work. So once we've framed an inquiry by grounding it in a logical starting point and adopting some reasonable working assumptions, so we are asking relevant and useful questions, we still need to get to the nitty-gritty details, and I heard that earlier, the devil's in the details. I think that's true with any law whatsoever. So we need to be able to find a way to move beyond just understanding perspectives behind positions to actually increasing our capacity to develop constructive ways forward. So from the outside, looking at an unfamiliar legal tradition, we look for simple answers and we look for rules. And I remember this distinctly when I started law school. I kept waiting for someone to give me the book of answers, and I was really shocked in first year to find out there was none forthcoming. But through that process, I went from seeing law as just a static set of rules that I had to memorize to a fluid, dynamic conversation in which I could participate if I knew the relevant decision makers, the terms of the debate, and the forms and limits of argumentation. And there's scholarship on it, but it's not that important. But basically, I went from an external point of view of Canadian law to an internal point of view where I could function within it. So I see from my own experience with Canadian law that why, when people look at Indigenous legal traditions, they look for something simple and they're looking for rules. But the problem that has arisen over time is that demanding this and answering these demands because you have to get anything done, is that it's reduced the way we've talked about Indigenous legal traditions into rhetoric or oversimplified pan-Indigenous rule-bound accounts. This feeds into stereotypes, both positive and negative, and it doesn't give us any way to understand Indigenous legal traditions as fluid, dynamic conversations in their rich complexity. We know better if we have a legal education. We know that law is in constant motion, and we have analytical tools from our own legal education that we can adapt and apply to better understand Indigenous legal traditions in more in-depth, realistic, and useful ways. So I'm proposing a shift in our questions. Again, this is all questioning at this stage. But it's moving from a shift where when people are talking about Indigenous legal traditions, they tend to talk about cultural values. And I'm suggesting we need to shift to ask, what are legal principles here? And rather than saying what's culturally appropriate here or what's traditional, we need to shift to be asking, what are the legitimate procedures for collective decision making? And overall, rather than saying what are the rules, what are the answers, as if we've never been to law school, shifting to saying what are the legal principles and legal processes for reasoning through specific environmental issues. So following these shifts, some of our questions could be, what are the legal concepts and categories within this particular Indigenous legal tradition that's relevant to the specific environmental issue at hand? What are the legal principles that are relevant? What are the legitimate procedures regarding this environmental issue? So overall, we're asking, what are the legal principles and legal processes for reasoning through this environmental issue in this fact scenario within this legal tradition? So these shifts and questions move us from a conversation about how legal practitioners should deal with or respond to isolated cultural practices or normative commitments they may not understand or agree with, and they may not find a ready equivalent within the common law tradition, to a conversation about reasoning through principles as integral but flexible parts of a comprehensive whole. So I want to give an environmental example, and I was told when I said I was going to give this talk that this is the one I needed to use, so I will. An example on a principle or value basis is the earth living? And this came up a little earlier when in environmental ethics, talking about different perspectives. When I said I was going to come talk at an environmental symposium, I was told by one elder that I was to confront all of you and ask you, how can you possibly think the earth is not living? So I have said that and passed that on, and I'll talk about the shifts that I think might be useful in that debate. So I think when we stay at the level of generalities and generalizations, we are often stuck in discussions that never seem to go anywhere productive. And whether or not the earth is a living being is a good example of one of these discussions. So I have heard people argue from both sides, obviously, that divergent worldviews on this issue is an insurmountable obstacle to bridging the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous approaches to environmental issues. That's why I was supposed to say that to you today. I don't have any definitive answers, but I do think the specific issues will look different when they're framed in terms of generalizations about cultural worldviews and incommensurable absolutes, and when issues are framed in terms of living legal principles, some of which may conflict, and some of which may provide legitimate ways for resolving a particular issue. So to work through the shifts I'm proposing in questions using this example, rather than using the language of cultural values, John Burroughs argues the earth as a living being is a present-day principle of central significance in an Anishinaabeg legal tradition. This highlights its importance, but it also makes it possible to imagine balancing it with other principles, just as we do within Canadian law. Critically, Burroughs also gives examples of legitimate processes and procedures through which his community debated and reached a collective decision regarding specific environmental issues. And the two examples he gives is a fishing stock conservation issue and an Alvar prairie development issue. But this demonstrates people reason through principles and processes today inside communities to solve specific problems. I think it also shows there is potential for outsiders, including legal practitioners, to identify and proceed through productive and legitimate avenues from Indigenous legal perspectives, particularly in consultation processes and possible accommodation measures. The conversation does not need to end in, they say the earth is living or they say the earth is not living. We can't go further, we can't discuss. So I think Burroughs demonstrates that when he does the switch. So for a particular issue in specific circumstances, we might ask, what are the general principles regarding this environmental issue? How do we interpret these principles? What are the exceptions? What other principles can or should be considered on these specific facts? How are legitimate decisions about such issues reached? And how does this law change to meet new circumstances? These type of questions will move us from understanding a position to understanding a legal reasoning process, and perhaps even participating in it. So in conclusion, I do believe it is possible to practically engage with Indigenous legal traditions on specific substantive levels in regard to environmental issues. And I suggest this engagement could start with the intellectual work described here, asking better questions that are grounded in logic, that are built on reasonable working assumptions, and that push past the generalities and generalizations to get to the specific principles. Note I say this is possible. I'm not saying it's easy. It won't be easy, and it shouldn't be. Serious and sustained engagement requires hard intellectual work. It requires us to treat Indigenous laws about the environment as we do other laws on an intellectual level, again, prior to the other questions. And this engagement is important on several levels. It won't give us all the answers, but it will give us an ability to ask better questions. Questions that may increase legal practitioners' understanding of Aboriginal perspectives and expand the possibilities for legitimate and effective processes for working through some of these issues. It may diffuse or avoid messy and expensive conflicts, and I think it could work towards a truly robust reconciliation within Canada between peoples. So I'd like to close on that endeavor and why I see it so important. And again, it's something that's come up again today when we're talking about frameworks and how to even articulate and think about these things. Robert Cover once famously described law as not merely a system of rules to be observed, but a world in which we live, a resource and signification. Legal traditions are not only prescriptive, they are descriptive. They ascribe meaning to human events, challenges, and aspirations. They are intellectual resources that we use to frame and interpret information and to reason through and act upon current problems and intergenerational projects. I don't need to tell you that there are many intractable problems and deep disagreements regarding complex environmental issues that impact us all, as well as the generations after us. We know we don't have all the answers. One way of looking at this endeavor of greater practical engagement with Indigenous legal traditions is that it's about recovering normative possibilities. It's about how we will tell the story of our shared future on and with this land.
So let's see here. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm sorry that I missed most of today, although I have gone through the papers and have some sense of what you were talking about. I'm sorry I missed on that. I was caught up in the Air Canada strike and trying to leave Vancouver this morning. So I'm going to be contradictory in the sense that I'm going to start with generalizations and then go to specifics. And I'm going to focus on what I know about in the work that I've been doing with the Haida Nation in protecting land and protecting ocean spaces. I want to begin by saying that First Nations, Aboriginal peoples live on the front lines of environmental damage. We're there, and I just want to, keep track of the time here. We're there when all the trees are clear cut. We're often the only people there with very little resources to protect the land. We live with the consequences for many generations, and the impact is profound. It impacts the root of who we are as people. I've seen, though, that often there's very little cooperation or working together between environmental practitioners and Aboriginal practitioners. And I hope that the example of what the Haida Nation has done to protect the land and the ocean will provide an example of how we could do that. Now, I think that one of the problems that often prevents that cooperation is that people in Canada view lands as being Crown or public lands, even though in places like British Columbia, Aboriginal title has not yet been addressed, and therefore it is not Crown land and it is not public lands. And so the first thing we have to address is Aboriginal title and the fact that there hasn't been any treaties in British Columbia, or there are still outstanding and unmet treaty promises in the rest of Canada. And yet I think there are such good opportunities of Aboriginal law to protect environmental places that are important to us and to environmental practitioners. I also think that reconciliation and the balancing of interests, while I know that can often be problematic in the environmental arena, that it can provide a good way to bring together people with very different interests to arrive at a better solution for decision making for the land. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I didn't know if anyone here had any general sense of Aboriginal law principles. I've just said here that Aboriginal title exists in Canada. It was here before Canada asserted any sovereignty to Canada, and I've set out some of the cases for that principle. Just as Aboriginal title pre-existed and survived the assertion of sovereignty, Indigenous and Haida laws have pre-existed and survived that assertion of sovereignty. The Supreme Court of Canada has confirmed that Aboriginal title and rights do not depend upon treaty, executive order, or legislative enactment. So they're pre-existing rights. Aboriginal title is the right to use the land for a wide range of purposes. They need not be related to integral Aboriginal practices, customs, or traditions. It's a property right, entitled to stand on equal footing with other property rights, including fee simple title. It confers the right to the land itself, so a lot of the litigation, the early litigation, was trying to say that Aboriginal rights are a bundle of rights to hunt or fish here, very site-specific rights, and not a right to the land, not a right to decision-making. It provides exclusive possession, occupation, use, and enjoyment of those lands. And to the natural resources on those lands. Lands held pursuant to Aboriginal title have an inescapable economic component. And one of the key things that I see, where I see similarities, is that it preserves a relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the land. And that is often what people who are advocates for the environment have, is a relationship and a connection to the land. And so we have that in common. Aboriginal law has a sustainability limit. It's been called an inherent limit, and the court looked at the fact that because we, Aboriginal peoples, were here before sovereignty, we've been here for generations, we've had a continuity with our relationship with the land, and therefore that continuity doctrine must extend into the future. It must not jeopardize future generations from enjoying the land in the same way. That is much of what I think you were talking about this morning. Aboriginal title is directed at the preservation of distinctive Aboriginal societies by securing their culturally integral relationships to the lands that sustain them. Aboriginal title confirms for the Aboriginal nation holding title the right to determine the uses to which the land will be put. That's decision-making powers. Then moving to reconciliation, the Supreme Court of Canada has placed reconciliation at the heart and the purpose of Section 35. It seeks to provide a constitutional framework for the protection of the distinctive cultures of Aboriginal peoples so that there can be recognition and reconciliation of Aboriginal interests. An aspect of reconciliation is the imperative to recognize, respect, and accommodate Aboriginal title and rights. Now, I just want to go into the worldviews and talk a little bit about, and I'm sorry to go into generalizations of what an Aboriginal worldview is, but I want to try to show how you can move from the general into the specific for the Haida Nation, and I'll give an example of what a Haida worldview is. And before I do that, I want to say that there is space in Canadian law to do this, in that Aboriginal rights are sui generis, which means that they're like this empty shell that needs to be filled by the content of what Aboriginal cultures are. So we need, our Aboriginal perspective informs what our rights are, what the title is, and how we achieve reconciliation and how we engage in decision-making processes. That, I think, gives an opportunity to protect the core values of Aboriginal peoples, and I hope that I can show with the example of what we've done in Haida Gwaii what those values are and how they've been protected. Now, an Aboriginal worldview is, it centers on a much different social, economic, and political environment, and as I said, it predates the expansion into Canada. An individual is only part of the whole. It's collective decision-making generally. There's transgenerational organic entities of family and community. In many Aboriginal cultures, we believe that we communicate with people from past generations and generations into the future, and that they help guide our decision-making and how we view the land and view the beings that we live with. We believe that everything is interconnected. What we do to one thing impacts another, and I know that this starts to sound like maybe what you were talking about today with the principles in environmental law, but these are very basic fundamental principles of Aboriginal cultures and societies. One of the what I think is one of the most important principles is that Aboriginal cultures come from the land. They're a reflection of who we are, and I think that David Suzuki had a life-changing moment when he realized that in speaking to Gujal, the president of the Haida Nation, when he asked him the question on the nature of things many, many years ago. And he said, so what would happen if Gwaihanas were logged? And Gujal's response was, well, then the land would be changed and we'd be just like everyone else in Canada. And that was really, it shifted how David viewed the land and the importance of protecting culture, not just environment, but culture as another tenet of what we need to look at when we're making decisions about the land. Of course, Aboriginal cultures are, I think we're the original bioregionalists, and depending upon the resources around us and how important that is to build trade relationships to ensure that that happens and that we can access other resources. We have an extended notion of personhood, which means that everything around us, every living being, is a person in and of themselves. Therefore, we are no better than other people. There's equity among us with other living beings. Some other basic principles are restraint in taking of resources. Many of the elders that we work with, that's one of the key laws that they say, is that you don't take too much. You only take what you need for your family, for feeding your family. You're not taking excessive amounts of resources from the land. And then you always have respect for those other people, for the salmon people, for the ocean people, all the living beings that surround you. What I often find is that in the environmental movement that there is an inappreciation of First Nations cultures in protecting the environment. And really, if we're all peoples, then we all need to be balanced together, and one is no better than the other, and First Nations cultures are as important when we look at protecting wildlife and environmental spaces. Often this idea of an extended notion of personhood is embedded in the languages of Aboriginal peoples. So for instance, we would call people from the word for Haida actually is the word for people. And that root word people is found in how we look at everything in the environment. So the salmon are salmon people, the beings that live in the forest are forest people, and that really is the root of how we see everything around us. Often in the oral traditions of Aboriginal peoples, you will find that animals play a key role in helping us to live in the environment. They will either give rewards or penalize people for not respecting the land, not interacting and managing the land in the way that you should. Often they'll teach you how to live with the land. Often the elders will talk about supernatural beings who come and tell you how to harvest fish, how to catch them, how to process them, how you live for them and care for them into the future. Now I just want to go a little specific into what this worldview means for the Haida Nation. We come from a very rich place in Canada. It's very rich in biodiversity, and that biodiversity is reflected in our culture. We have a culture of abundance. Our socio-cultural traditions are based on sharing that abundance in potlatches. We see the cedar tree as a sister who has such abundance in providing everything that we needed in traditional Haida culture. Our clothing, our transportation with the canoes, our housing, our hunting, cooking, fishing implements, our ceremonial objects, how we connect with our neighbors, how we take from the land, how we care for our children, how we care for ourselves as women. It all comes from the cedar tree. And because the cedar tree is a sister, she is there nourishing all of the old growth dependent species, the marbled murrelets, the ancient murrelets, all the medicines that you find on the ocean floor, all the birds that live in the canopy of the old growth forest. It's a culture of abundance. And then we have in the Haida worldview, Creek women who are supernatural beings who live at the mouth of every river. And they are essentially the stewards of all the resources in the river. So you go to them and you ask permission before you can take the salmon from the river. And we see the bears bringing gifts of salmon to the Creek women, leaving them on the ocean floor, which then nourishes the trees. And so really it provides an insight into an ecosystem or watershed approach and how you see how everything is interconnected and how respect helps guide you through those interconnections. You can see physically what this relationship is with the cedar tree in the early photographs of Haida culture in the 1800s when at first contact, when people first came and met with the Haida people, all you see is a whole forest of the cedar trees turned into cultural objects that help support and were the basis of our culture. Many of the crests of the Haida Nation, our very identity of who we are represented by products from the forest. We bring out those oral histories in the potlatch through the creation of, say, for instance, a raven mask and dancing that. So the cedar tree helps solidify what we are as a culture and connecting the people in the audience as witnesses to knowing what our culture is. Another central tenet is that everything is connected, and we see that in the oral histories of the Haida Nation where raven transforms between the ocean and the forest and the sky world, and there's a constant flux between them. There is no division, it's not separate, it's all the same. So from that, we learn that in what we do, we have to respect those histories. We have to take a watershed approach to resource management. We can't take the site-specific approach that you see in many natural resource legislation, like in Canada, like in British Columbia, or even site-specific approaches to protecting cultural heritage. We need to take new management regimes that protect cultural keystone species like the cedar tree for people on the Northwest Coast. Similarly, we are a culture that reflects the abundance of the ocean. We view the halibut as our uncles. Like the cedar tree, the halibut takes care of us, provides for, in Haida Gwaii, we didn't have land mammals, so our primary source of protein came from the halibut, and then second, the salmon. In the ocean is a complete whole undersea world, and all of the people who live there are the salmon people, the herring people, and those are really the keystone species for us in the ocean. In the Haida worldview, killer whales are the chiefs of the undersea world, and they occupy every single rocky outcrop in Haida Gwaii. It's either a raven or an eagle outcrop, and underneath that rocky outcrop is a chief who governs and takes care of the ocean environment. In our oral traditions, we have come to live on this earth 3 times, and each time did not work. We came out of the air, we came out of the mud, and each time we tried to live, it didn't work. The 3rd time, we came out of the ocean. And so for Haida people, the ocean is very important for us, and it's our birthplace. And that's really important for us. Some people may have a very deep connection to a place because of the beauty of it, but our connection is even deeper in that my flesh has actually come from that land. I've actually come from the oceans of Haida Gwaii. So how do we uphold these worldviews and reconcile how we view the land? How do we infuse the Haida worldview to take us forward into managing, dealing with environmental damage and managing the resources going forward? We need to assess what do we need to continue practicing our cultures? What are the cultural keystone species that will keep our culture alive? We need to look at the past impacts of those cultural keystone species. We need to look at the impact of, for instance, clear-cut logging on the old-growth cedar. And then we need to see what role they play going forward. What role can they play in sustaining our culture and sustaining the ecosystems? So I then want to move to the example of Haida Gwaii. The Haida Nation began designating areas as protected areas in 1981. It was almost a decade before British Columbia began the whole practice of land use planning. And these were very simple early designations. They weren't sophisticated, they weren't complicated. They were made by the then president of the Haida Nation, Percy Williams. And we just basically drew on the map. And we said, you will not go into this area. That area in the Haida language is called Dugust. It means the West Coast. It's a place where we took refuge in our oral histories in the times of the flood. And because of that, and because of the abundance of that area, we said there will be no industrial activities in this area. And it was simple as that. And from there, we began designating many other areas. Now, this was in the 1980s. This was a time with increased industrial logging of Haida Gwaii, and the elders looked at what was occurring and said, we can't just sit back and wait for it to be determined who owns the land. There's so much impact on the land. When we finally get to resolving that issue, there will be nothing left. So because of the elders telling the leadership at the time that it's not so important about who owns it, it's important about protecting it, that led to the approach that we took in the Gwaii-Haanas Agreement. So from the Dugust, we went down to Lyle Island, and the Haidas engaged in blockade to protect that area. It resulted in the Gwaii-Haanas Agreement, an agreement between the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada to create a park reserve. It isn't a national park yet, but it's a national park reserve until the title issue is addressed. We set our 2 different divergent views of who owned the land, but nonetheless agreed to protect the land going forward. We've taken that approach for another ocean area that we signed a memorandum of agreement in 2010 to protect the Bowie Seamount, which is 180 kilometers off the edge of Haida Gwaii. When we were engaged in blockades in the 1980s, the people on the other side of the blockade were the loggers. And we realized that even though we were up against the people who were making a living from the forest, that there were still commonalities where we could work together. And that we developed relationships over the years so that the logging communities signed protocol agreements with the Haida Nation, putting their trust in the fact that the Haida Nation would take care of their collective future more than the Government of Canada would or the Government of British Columbia. In our designations of the land and in our agreements, we've been very careful to ensure that while the BC government or the Canadian government may create a park reserve or may engage in land use planning or may create conservancies, that first we had our own designations and exercised our own decision-making and sovereignty in creating our own designations and our own management structures that sat parallel with the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada. Since 1981, we drew 14 areas on the map that we said were important to us for historical, for cultural, and environmental reasons. In this context, the Haida brought the Haida case all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada to challenge logging in Tree Farm License 39, which was then owned by Maple and Bodell. Shortly after, in the midst of that decision, predating the Supreme Court of Canada's decision, the Haida started working with all the people in the local communities to develop a land use plan, taking stock of what was there, what was the damage that had been done, what do we all agree can be done with the land going forward. And that they developed a Haida land use vision in 2004. It was called Ya Gudang, which means the easiest translation in the English language is respect. It's taking care of ourselves, taking care of our communities, taking care of the land. We set out priorities for future development of the land. Protection of cedar were key, protection of salmon, protection of the black bears, birds, the plants, and the shoreline areas. We came to call the land use vision the birds, the beads, and the trees. As I said, the land use vision looked at what was the condition of the land, what was the ability of the land to be able to support future development, looking at the cumulative impacts. We pulled together a technical team of local people and also environmental organizations. The Gaia Institute was key in working on the technical team. And we looked at what the environmental condition of the land was and how that would impact decision-making going forward. We looked at the keystone species, the old-growth forest, marble murrelet habitat, and the riparian forest watershed conditions, so that whole linkage between the salmon, the bears, and the old-growth cedar. After we had won at the Supreme Court of Canada, the government replaced Tree Farm License 39, even though the Supreme Court of Canada had made all of the rulings that it did in the Haida case. So the Haida brought another peaceful blockade, only this time it wasn't just the Haida people on the blockade, it was actually the logging community. The people who were engaged in logging sat with the Haida and said, this is enough. We need to find some future for all of us going forward. There can be no logging, and we need to work this out. The Haida and the local community signed a letter of understanding in 2005 where the blockades were stood down. Revenue sharing was provided to be able to support the process of land use planning. In 2007, the Haida entered into or signed a land use plan with the BC government. It reduced the rate of logging, it addressed land uses, it brought in ecosystem-based management over the land base, and key to the Haida was, of course, protection of cultural and ecological values. In 2009, the BC government established conservancies over those very same 14 areas that the Haida drew on the map starting in 1981. Through the land use planning, we've protected 52% of the land base, about 500,000 hectares. We protected 74% of the shoreline because of the marine birds that are so important to us to take care of and protect. We've established special conservancies that take care of cultural and environmental values, the old-growth cedar, new cedar that is important for weaving, the riparian fish forests, bears, and bear den sites. For the rest of the land base, outside of the 52%, we implemented ecosystem-based management planning. Once the designations were made, we then needed to turn to how are we going to manage this together, and we entered into a protocol agreement that is called the Kunstagu Kunstaya Protocol. And again, we adopted the Guayhanas approach of setting aside the differences over who owns the land and who has authority and jurisdiction, but finding a way to work together. We realize that we need to take an incremental approach to achieving reconciliation of the different interests, that this wasn't the final solution of how we're going to protect the land and manage it going forward. BC committed to making legislative changes to allow for that. BC's legislation still doesn't reflect the principles coming out of the Haida decision, but the BC government agreed to amend legislation if we're not able to achieve decision-making in the way that we need it to under the protocol agreement. One of the key concerns that we brought forward in the Haida case at all the different court levels was the fact that we can't be involved in consultation and accommodation on operational level issues. We can't be involved about what will be cut here, where will a road be input. We needed to be involved in the strategic level decisions, what will be logged, how much will be logged, and how will it be logged. And so the Kunstagu-Kunstaya protocol deals with those strategic level decisions. I think it's an agreement that's unique in Canada in that BC and the Haida are actually creating an on-the-ground example of what reconciliation could look like. This protocol is thoroughly grounded in the Haida land use vision, Yah Gudang, that idea of respect. It's also guided by a Haida stewardship law. So the Haida enacted a stewardship law, which I'll talk about in a minute. Under the protocol agreement, we set out a 3-tier framework for decision-making. We created a solutions table that deals with the more operational level decisions, analyzing and assessing each application. We created a management council that makes joint decisions. They operate by consensus and they address the strategic level decisions. They've just finished in January deliberating about the AAC in Haida Gwaii. It's the only place where you'll find a First Nation actually setting the AAC in Canada. Both parties have committed under the agreement to make the best decisions for Haida Gwaii. These are the areas, I won't go through them, the strategic level decisions that the Management Council has been assigned to it under the protocol agreement. Last year, BC passed legislation to implement the protocol. They also restored the name Haida Gwaii. We used to be called the Queen Charlotte Islands. We're now officially Haida Gwaii. In 2010, the land use objectives were established, and BC's legislation came into effect last year. The stewardship law that I talked about, I just want to briefly touch on that, but under the stewardship law, we created the management bodies that would enable Haida participation in the co-management. A grounding principle of the stewardship law is to protect the land for future generations, and that directly comes from the Haida Constitution. The preamble of the Haida Constitution sets out the constitutional mandate for the Council of the Haida Nation, which is to protect the land for future generations. That came directly from those elders in 1980 who said, we've got to protect this land for future. We can't be getting stymied and stuck on the question of who owns the land. Throughout the Haida Stewardship Law, you will see the recognition of the inherent responsibilities of the Haida to protect all living things. I've set out Section 3A of that law to ensure the well-being of our environment and create an economy that is respectful of the land and culture and people through establishing structures to manage the forests, the lands, and the manner in which humans interact with the natural world. It directly again incorporates Yah Gudang, and the need to protect the life systems of Haida Gwaii. Yah Gudang guides the solutions table, but also the Management Council in their decisions. I don't have time to get into how we've also replicated this on the ocean. We've also taken a similar approach and have worked really hard in pulling from the elders and interviewing them. What are the laws about how we live with the ocean, with all the beings that live in the ocean? What activities are permitted in our waters surrounding all of Haida Gwaii? What ships and vessels can pass through our waters? All of that is addressed in our marine use plan. And we're building upon the work of the Haida working with Canada since the Gwaii-Hanas Agreement in creating a co-management agreement. We recently signed, when the Gwaii-Hanas Agreement was signed in the 1980s, Canada committed to also extending that boundary out to the ocean. They recognized the need that the Haida wanted to protect from the mountaintop to the ocean floor, and so last year we created the marine component of the Gwaii-Hanas Agreement. So that body, the Archipelago Management Board, will also be managing and stepping through the marine use planning that we've been engaged in for the last 10 years. Now, I just want to portray what this looks like in pictures because I think it's better than listening to me continuing talking, and I think I've gone over almost out of time here. So this is Haida Gwaii, for those of you who don't know where it is. I don't know if I have a pointer, but the Bawi Seamount, as I said, is 180 kilometers off the, I'm a little bit dyslexic on space, the northwestern tip of Haida Gwaii. I love this picture. Everybody loves this picture who's from Haida Gwaii. It shows the beauty of Haida Gwaii. Another name is These Shining Islands, and they truly are beautiful shining islands, and this is a photograph from space. So Haida Gwaii is 1 million hectares. This is what it looked like. It's projecting what the land would have looked like before it was logged. And from that land comes this culture. These are the totem poles that many of you have seen throughout Canada that actually originate in Haida Gwaii. These are the Indian reserves on Haida Gwaii. 0.16% of the land base the Canadian government allocated for Haida people to live on. You can barely see them, the little dots in yellow over the land base here. These are the tenures that the BC government unilaterally granted over Haida Gwaii. They're shown in red. It's the heartland of Haida Gwaii. The areas shown in red were the most productive forests of Haida Gwaii. The areas shown in green were the areas that had been protected under provincial legislation in 1980. So almost the entire land base is allocated, 99.84%. The areas shown in gray are those lands that are held under fee simple, about 2.8% of the land base. Early on in our negotiations with the BC government offered, this is the cap on what you can achieve in BC under the treaty process, 5% of the land base. You can't see that 5% here. It wasn't suitable to the Haida Nation to negotiate a treaty with that constraint. In 2004, the BC government offered to protect 450 hectares. They offered a cutting license of 27,000 cubic meters for 10 years. The Haida said no. The BC also offered in 2005, they said, well, you've drawn these areas on a map. It's 24% of Haida Gwaii. Let's enter into a treaty to protect these areas. And it's what you said you wanted protected, and the Haida said no, because there still is 75% of the land base that we need to have protection and have some control over the activities over that land base. These are what the land use plan looks like graphically. All of the blue areas are the areas that are under ecosystem-based management planning. All of the areas in green are the areas that are now protected under BC, federal, or Haida laws. 51% of the land base. When you start looking at the connection between the cedar, the salmon, and Haida culture, the cedar and the salmon, we then started protecting that riparian fish forest connection. So all of that veining through it are the streams that need to be protected to protect that relationship between the salmon, the bears, and the cedar. Also, there are additional areas that have crept into the blue, which are the areas that contain old-growth cedar, that have birds that are important to us, and medicines that are important to Haida culture. This is what the agreement looks like in 2010. The area down on this lower left-hand side is the Gwaii-Haanas Agreement, including the marine component of the Gwaii-Haanas Agreement. All of the areas in green are the conservancies and the Haida protected areas, which also go off into the nearshore and far shore areas of Haida Gwaii. After we worked through the protection, the Haida negotiated the tenures. They're shown in red. So these are areas that the Haida will engage in ecosystem-based management, sustainable logging practices. We then negotiated, as part of the accommodation, the ability to purchase the tenure that was held by Macmillan Bodell, the tenure that we challenged in the Haida case. The only remaining tenure is the area in blue, which the Haida are also going to be acquiring, so that effectively all of the lands will be under our control. So now looking at what hasn't been protected, they're the areas in gray, the fee simple, and the one tenure that I talked about in blue. So almost all of Haida Gwaii has now been protected. That's another visual representation of the areas protected in Haida Gwaii. So part of our work in moving there was we worked with the Gaogaia Institute to assess the damage to the land. As I said, we looked at the environmental conditions. We assessed the volumes and values of trees that had been cut, and that fed into the work. That helped us to understand the extent of damage and how we needed to move forward. That will also directly feed into our seeking of damages under Aboriginal title litigation. All of the success depended upon advanced preparation. We worked with the local communities since the 1980s. We just celebrated 25 years since the Guayhanas Agreement. All of the Lyle Island actions occurred. We've been building relationships with the local communities, with the loggers, with the fishermen, with the sports fishing, everyone trying to recognize that all of us depend upon each other. Because we sat down and drew what was important to us early on, that impacted where we're going today. It really was critical to have the technical and cultural analyses done, and it was important to have those relationships going forward. Of course, because the Haida engaged in blockade, they engaged in litigation, they engaged in negotiation, and they engaged in land use planning, that all fed into getting to where we are today. In 2002, the Haida Nation filed an Aboriginal title lawsuit. It was put in abeyance in 2008. We've been conducting depositions of elders through which we're gathering more information about the Haida laws that guide us going forward. We've been preparing since 2002, although the case is in abeyance, although we've given notice that we're going back to court. We gave that notice in February of this year. Part of what we presented in our negotiations was the fact that if we are already working together, it isn't a big step to create an umbrella agreement to try to solidify how we're working together, to have one body protecting and managing all of Haida Gwaii. The Kunstagu Kunstaya means the beginning in the Haida language. I don't want people to think that that's the final solution, that co-management in that body is the end and be all. It's an initial step towards reconciliation. But we're hoping that through this, we know that we're building capacity for co-managing together. It also will give an on-the-ground example of how you can actually achieve reconciliation that will help guide the court in trying to decide how to make declarations of title and what reconciliation actually looks like. And I hope this helps in considering a different perspective on environmental damage and how that guides decision-making going forward. Thank you. Over my time.
Thank you very much, Terry Lynn. I wonder if perhaps both you and Hadley would mind standing up there, and the questions I'm sure will come to both of you, and they're already coming. While they're coming down, I have a very practical question that as I was listening to both Hadley and Terry Lynn, because they focused on two different legal traditions, it occurred to me that the Cree would have a very different focus in some respects, practical focus, than the Haida Nation in terms of just their physical environment and so forth. And it raised the obvious question of, is there a commonality across Aboriginal legal traditions? Certainly at a general level, I could imagine, for example, the Institute has done a fair bit of work in Russia, and including work with Aboriginal communities there, indigenous communities, they put it, and the relationship between the land and the people, the taiga and the groups, and also the importance of certain animals, the reindeer in that case. I can see that level of commonality, but I wonder if there's been any scholarship or is there any interchange with other, across First Nations to articulate some commonality of Aboriginal legal principles, or is that possible? And I'll ask that of both of you, I guess.
Big question mark. I'll just take a crack here.
You'll have to use the microphone.
Okay,
Right.
I think, I think what what's illustrated, even what Terry Lynn has demonstrated on the ground, is just the complexity of each particular legal tradition. And I think that work hasn't necessarily been done and scholarship out. And I think once that work is done, I think those commonalities, there's certainly ones that are apparent, but I think too quickly we rush to pan-Indigenous.
Right.
And so I'm avoiding that. And I think I thought Terry Lynn's very specific example demonstrated like how exactly what you're saying, like how odd it would be to conflate Haida and Cree. Or
Because certainly one hears often, people will talk generally about, well, in Aboriginal legal traditions. But the question is, I suppose, is that useful when it gets down to the level of detail, especially that Terry Lynn's been talking about? I mean, is that even helpful, I guess?
What we really wanted to do is ensure that the land and the species that were important to us filtrated up so that it was a direct reflection of the land, how we got to that end picture. So I think that we have to do that ground up for every nation to get to the decision making and the land use planning, or whatever solution works for the other Aboriginal peoples.
Oops, we've got lots of questions from the floor. The first question, and it's to Terry Lynn. Can you say whether it would have been possible for the Haida to reach agreements with government without the support of loggers and other land users, i.e. how critical was their support?
Well, the Guayhanas agreement was achieved with the Haida, and environmental organizations certainly helped in the work of lobbying across Canada. I found that it was helpful in the Supreme Court of Canada. The village of Port Clements intervened in favor of the Haida at the Supreme Court of Canada and said that if BC is here representing the public interest, we're here to say that they're not representing our public interest, and we're the most directly affected if this tenure is overturned, and we would rather be with the Haida Nation and their protection of the land. So it is powerful to have non-Indigenous communities involved, and it certainly helps to work together. And so I was hoping to say that in looking at how in what I think you'll look at today and tomorrow about how difficult balancing can have a negative impact on environmental protection, that actually involving more together and working together and creating our future together is very empowering for all groups involved.
Thank you. This question is for Hadley. Do you think that Aboriginal legal traditions could or should form a part of the common law?
It's an interesting question. There's some argument that they already do, that there's spaces within the common law. I think the common law is flexible enough to be able to understand and integrate with Aboriginal legal traditions, but again, I don't think that deep work has been done on the other side of that, looking at specific Indigenous legal traditions and looking at whether or not there's fits with the common law. So I think we're waiting for that work. Want to answer?
Okay. What are the chances of presenting this information, I think the discussion we've had today, in the context of the Northern Gateway regulatory process? Given the adversarial nature of the process and given the lack of understanding of cultural keystone species in the assessment process? That's not a controversial question at all.
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, I just came from oral hearings in Skidegate for the project to solicit oral history from the Haida people from the Southern Haida people. And what we're finding is that in the same way that the issues of unsustainable logging brought together the communities, that in an even greater way, the communities are joining together in opposition against the project. So while the process could be adversarial, it ends up strengthening people's resolve to work together and see that we're all in this together. So it remains to be seen what the outcome will be and where we'll go with the process, but certainly it could get even more adversarial with litigation down the road. So.
Hadley, this question for you. The sort of questions you've asked, the discussion that you say basically should take place about legal traditions, where should you have this discussion? Before regulators, in a courtroom, in a classroom, and as a secondary point, getting a recognition of constitutional rights is difficult. How do you advance the idea of indigenous laws or indigenous legal traditions?
I think the conversations, again, start ground up. And one of the things in the last 2 years, Val Napoli and I have been asked to come into communities and do some work where people are able to articulate their own laws and draw them out within the community. So it's a part of a turning away within communities, saying rather, where's the balance? So we are going to look at our own legal tradition and we're going to take those first steps before we turn to the litigation, before we're doing it before regulatory bodies, etc. We're going to focus on this first. And so I think that's the first step. And the question that goes to, can an Aboriginal right be recognized? What does that mean for Indigenous laws within these systems? Again, I think that's the second step as communities are starting to do that really deep on the groundwork.
Terry Lynn,
I
this
could just
question.
I just wanted to add something.
Yes.
When the Guayhanas Agreement was created, we had not been to court to have our rights recognized. And so the beauty of what the approach that the Haida have taken is not to wait for recognition of those rights, but to start implementing them, to start making land use decisions. And I would hope that all Aboriginal communities are doing the same thing in exercising sovereignty and looking at what places are important to us and simply acting on it. So I've seen in the literature for the papers that while there may be environmental legislation protecting the environment, that the problem is in implementation. Well, Aboriginal peoples have had the same problem in that we have the Supreme Court of Canada saying Aboriginal title exists. We have the Supreme Court of Canada saying that the Haida have a strong case, that we have a strong case of right to the forest, and yet nothing happens. And so the decision was made that we're not going to wait for implementation, but we have to take the steps to implement it to ensure that it actually is applied on the ground.
This actually, the next question follows actually pretty much on that comment. It's for you, and it says, how significant to the Haida's success was the setting aside of property issues, given that the traditional Canadian legal construct of land, wildlife, etc. as property tends to exclude enjoyment of non-economic or engagement of non-economic interests?
The Haida have set aside the issue of who owns what, but it still remains to be determined in litigation. But the Haida have also recognized that there are fee simples that belong to individual Canadians in Haida Gwaii that we would not overturn. But we've joined, because we are showing deference to those fee simples, even though they are also challengeable in Canadian Aboriginal law, that we've helped to build alliances with the local communities to look at what our economic future would look like in the future. And I don't know if I've answered that question, but...
Okay. And one last question, I guess, at least from the floor. What is your philosophy? I suspect this is with respect to you, Terry Lynn, with regard to living in harmony with animals, fish, etc., yet using them for food to sustain you rather than to sustain them.
Well, part of the idea that everything is a being means that we acknowledge that almost every Aboriginal nation acknowledges that beings are giving of their life for us to survive. And so then living from the land is a reflection of that. It's very different than going to a superstore and buying meat or buying fish there. But it's an actual engagement with the fish or with the animals and the connection that we have to them that is important in that relationship.
I have one general question, I guess, and it relates to everything we've been discussing today. What strikes me is, especially listening to both Hadley and Terry Lynn, is that so many of these concepts are concepts that one finds, that is concepts from Aboriginal legal traditions, are concepts that have entered, perhaps not with the same vocabulary, but they've certainly entered environmentalism, let's say, not just environmental law, but they've entered the environmental movement. Even something like the earth as a living being, the concept of Gaia is not a new one anymore. And virtually everything we've talked about in terms of intergenerational equity, adaptive management, and so forth, those sorts of concepts seem inherent in much of what both of you have talked about this afternoon. And I guess my question is, has there been any attempt to engage directly people from, say, the deep ecology movement, or is it two separate conversations that are going on? And indeed, is there a value in finding allies there? It strikes me that it's not hard to translate one concept into another. In many cases, they're the same concept, and I'll leave that to both of you, actually.
Well, it certainly can't hurt to have those alliances. My gosh, if we can create alliances and work together with the government or with people cutting the trees that we're trying to protect, then certainly a lot can be achieved through working together. But I would say it would be beneficial to have that connection.
I can just add briefly, I think on the ground there has been some very uneasy alliances and there's been some real successes, but there's often on the ground there reaches a breaking point in the communities I've worked with where those alliances have been drawn, but sometimes things do diverge, so maybe more work in the processes because it is valuable. I agree.
Thank you. If there are no other questions, that will conclude our session for this afternoon. I'd like to thank Terry Lynn and Hadley very much for those insights. They're really useful. And we will resume tomorrow morning. I'd say I don't know what your